Hey everyone, welcome to the Inflammation Nation podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Steve Noseworthy.
One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. This is part 2 of the stomach acid and bile part of our Miracle Molecules series. And we're going to be talking about bile today. Last episode, we talked about hydrochloric acid and how it functions to activate pepsin, which is actually what does the digesting of protein in your diet. It's not the hydrochloric acid, but it's the pepsin that comes from that. But what we focused on in the context of this idea of miracle molecules was the fact that hydrochloric acid is used to lower the pH of the stomach, which increases the acidity, in order to kill potential infections hidden in your food. And given that this is, essentially the first line of defense against ingested microbes, hydrochloric acid is part of what's called your innate immune system, and it plays a key role in immune competence. Today, we finish off by talking about bile, which in addition to its function in digestion, plays key roles in immune competence, detoxification, as well as balancing the microbiome. Now, I did mention a few functions of bile the last time in my introduction, so I'll just go through those quickly. First of all, bile acids aid in the digestion of fat from your diet through a process called emulsification. And that's basically breaking down large fat droplets into smaller ones that are easier to break down even further by pancreatic lipases for eventual absorption. And because vitamins A, D, E, and K are fat-soluble and not water-soluble, you need bile to break down the fat from your diet so that you can extract and absorb vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, and vitamin K. Bile is also used to metabolize and get rid of excess cholesterol, and it neutralizes the acidic pH of the food that comes from the stomach into the small intestine. It also provides bactericidal activity or antimicrobial activity against organisms, again, present in the food that you eat. And it's part of the detoxification system, which, I've spoken about detoxification system at length in other episodes. We probably won't revisit that particular topic, but I do want to focus on a couple of things. While hydrochloric acid kills bacteria by creating a very acidic environment that some bacteria can't live in, bile contributes to immunity through a different mechanism. In fact, bile is not an acid like hydrochloric acid is, but it's what we call a base, which is what neutralizes acid. And you might think, well, since infections don't thrive in an acid environment, then that's part of the point of hydrochloric acid. Maybe if you neutralize the acid in the small intestine by secreting bile, maybe that would encourage things to grow. Wouldn't that promote infections? And the thought is, let's say, partially correct. The reality is that as good as stomach acid is at sterilizing your food, some microbes that are in the food that you eat are actually acid resistant, and they will slip through the stomach into the small intestine right at the spot where your liver and your gallbladder release bile. And while bile itself isn't necessarily directly antimicrobial, and that's kind of a somewhat untrue statement, but let's just for the moment say, bile itself isn't directly antimicrobial. The secondary bile metabolites that are the result of good bacteria in your gut metabolizing bile are antimicrobial. So let me explain that. Most people, I think including many doctors, think that bile is actually made in the gallbladder, right? But bile is actually made in the liver, which uses cholesterol as a base molecule to make it. And the bile made in the liver is then exported to the gallbladder, where it accumulates, it gets concentrated, and then is released somewhat on demand in large quantities when you eat food that has fat in it. And as I said before, the bile emulsifies the fat. It breaks it down, helps us get those fat-soluble vitamins out of it. But as the bile travels through the small and the large intestines, the bacteria in your gut, your probiotics, gobble up some of the bile, and they make these things called secondary bile metabolites or secondary bile acids. And there are many of them, but the primary ones that we know about that are, pretty routinely studied are called deoxycholic and lithocholic acid. Not that you need to know those things. Now, this is a fairly new area of research, but here's what I think we can say for now with some certainty. Number one, bile itself, as well as these secondary bile acids, can directly inhibit certain types of bacteria. Bacteria like C. diff, and you may have heard of that, is quite often causes diarrhea in people who use multiple rounds of antibiotics or even a single course of a very powerful antibiotic like Cipro. It also turns out that some immune cells have bile acid receptors. And so when these secondary bile metabolites interact with immune cells, they increase immune activity in the gut, making these immune cells more effective and more efficient. And this includes cell types like monocytes or T cells, B cells, even what we call natural killer cells, which all coordinate together to create efficient immunity. Bile acids also modulate the function of a very special type of cell called dendritic cells, which are critical for immune competence through the process of surveillance. Basically, these dendritic cells in your gut patrol the gut environment, and they pick up and examine potential infections, even toxins, and essentially help your immune system decide if it needs to deal with it, to decide whether or not it should activate against whatever it finds. And then finally, bile acids help to control the overactivation of immune cells that are very specific to hollow or open spaces, meaning your gut, your lungs, your sinuses, even your bladder. And these special cells are called Th17 cells, and they're somewhat of a double-edged sword. This Th17 system, again, which is necessary for open space immunity, or what we might call mucosal immunity, referring to the lining of these open spaces. That Th17 system is very important so that you can fight off infections that target your lungs, your gut, your sinuses, your bladder. But the Th17 system is also what gets out of control when you have autoimmunity, which means that you want controlled and balanced activation of Th17 cells. You don't want to lose control of that. And part of that control comes from how your probiotics process bile into these secondary metabolites, which then modulate and help keep control and keep balance of that Th17 system. And all of this points to something that I've said many times before, and that is that we tend to learn something about how our body works, and then we pigeonhole that thing, and we think that that's all that that thing does. So if you randomly asked people how bile affects your immune system, you would probably get a puzzled look, because almost everyone thinks that the only thing that bile does is help you to digest your dietary fats. So I'm fairly sure that what I've shared about the role of bile in gut-based immunity is probably new information, and I hope it raises some other questions as well. So for example, if someone goes on a low-fat diet, does that have an impact on gut immunity? After all, a low-fat diet means that less bile is being released into the intestines to emulsify the fat you eat because there's less fat there. But less bile means less secondary bile acids and a potential impact on gut-based immune capacity, meaning a low-fat diet with low biliary output or bile output could result in decreased gut immunity. Now, someone might adopt a low-fat diet because they mistakenly think that eating fat makes you fat, and maybe they're trying to lose weight, or maybe they have a gallbladder problem. And every time they eat fatty foods, they get right shoulder pain, or they get this kind of colicky pain in the right upper quadrant of their abdomen. Maybe they have thickened what we call biliary sludge, or maybe even gallstones, and they've been told to avoid fats, or else they're going to end up having to have their gallbladder removed, or maybe they've had their gallbladder removed. Either way, whatever drives someone to eat less fat, for example, or if they get their gallbladder removed, as a result of reduced bile flow, many experience an increased risk for gut infections. In fact, we have studies from back in the 1990s that show that the incidence of H. pylori, which is a very common gut infection, it's a bacteria that can often cause ulcers and reflux. But we have studies again from the mid-90s and just a little bit earlier that show that the incidence of H. pylori is twice as high after gallbladder is removed. So we know that if you reduce bile flow through any mechanism, that you lose some potential ability to fight off infections that are quite common. So just to reiterate, when you have adequate bile flow, the healthy bacteria in your gut metabolize the bile and create secondary bile acids, which then can directly inhibit some acid-resistant bacteria that escape the stomach acid in your stomach. They can activate a wide range of immune cells, T cells, B cells, natural killer cells. They can enhance the ability of gut-based dendritic cells to surveil the environment, to pick up on infections and toxins and alert other immune cells to deal with it. And it can enhance the control over the Th17 immune subsystem, which is again specific to what we call hollow space immunity, but also which can drive autoimmunity if it gets overactive and it's not controlled. Obviously, this is very cool stuff. It is, one might say it is miraculous. All right, one final aspect of bile, and that is its role in the microbiome. Not as a thing that the microbiome consumes to help support immunity, but the impact that bile has on the microbiome itself. Now, we've known this for at least a decade, but I'm going to share some insights from several papers published in the last few years. I just told you that the microbiome can take bile and make these bile acids. But more recently, scientists have discovered that your microbiome can take amino acid precursors, things like taurine and glycine, which you get from your diet, and actually make these bile acids by themselves. They don't have to start with bile and then break the bile down. They can take the components that the liver normally uses to make bile, and they can make bile completely independent of the liver itself. And their capacity to do so goes way beyond these typical base amino acids of taurine and glycine that I had mentioned before, even though those are probably the most common ones. The microbiome can take almost any amino acid, certainly the most common ones that we talk about, and they can make some form of a secondary bile acid. And so both primary and secondary bile acids affect the profile of the microbiome. And this is very complex, and scientists are trying to sort this out. But the simple story is that certain bile acids and metabolites affect certain species of healthy bacteria, but not others. So on one hand, we have bile and bile acids that help to kill certain types of organisms that we don't really want in the gut, or that we don't want there in large amounts. And it can enhance the growth of certain types of healthy bacteria, but not all. And the type of bacteria is going to depend on which bile acid we're talking about. So again, it's very complicated. If you consider the fact that there are dozens of known primary and secondary bile acids, coupled with the fact that there are thousands of bacterial species in your gut, you can see why I say this is complicated. Right on top of that, as science and technology improves, they find new types of bile acids that we couldn't identify before, and new probiotic species, which just simply adds to the complexity. But the fact remains that there is this bidirectional relationship between your gut bacteria and the bile that you produce from your liver. And we're seeing scientists using the term the bile microbiome axis to describe how they work together. In addition to antibacterial effects of bile, bile acids can indirectly control the growth of bad gut bacteria by regulating the expression of nitric oxide synthase, as well as antimicrobial peptides. And because bile inhibits bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine, it is particularly important in cases of IBS or irritable bowel syndrome that might be caused by SIBO or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And not only can bile acids kill bacteria in the small intestines, they protect the gut lining and prevent leaky gut. Plus, they inhibit translocation or the movement of bacteria. And this is another feature of SIBO, where bacteria from the large intestine migrate up into the small intestine to cause trouble. And if you don't have adequate bile output and bile flow into the small intestine, it's easy for bacteria from the large intestine to go too high in the system and literally to feed off sugars, starches, and fibers in your diet and then cause issues and cause problems. Now, one final note on bile and bad bacteria in the gut. Some bacteria produce what are called endotoxins. There are many different kinds. Some are worse than others. This is very common and potentially a huge problem because these toxins, the more potent ones, can not only mess up the local gut environment, causing things like leaky gut and gut inflammation and so on, but these endotoxins can either cross the gut bacteria, the gut barrier, and get into systemic circulation. Or they can activate the systemic immune system and create systemic inflammation, even though the toxins themselves may actually stay inside the gut. And that's a more complex mechanism I don't want to go into right here. Well, it turns out that when something interferes with bile production and bile release into the small intestine, these endotoxins increase in the gut. So lower bile means more toxins. And adding back bile acids or restoring bile flow reduces the toxin load. How does that work? Well, because bile acids act like sponges to bind to these toxins, which will neutralize them so that you can eliminate them before they have a chance to create some kind of a negative impact by eroding tissues, causing inflammation, or causing local and systemic immune activity. All right, I'm going to leave it there for bile and hydrochloric acid, and I'm going to close out this mini-series on miracle molecules, not because I've run out of things to talk about, but because, honestly, if I kept going, this series would never end, because there's so many things that go on in the body that are just so cool to think about and so cool to talk about. So having said that, what's next? Well, I just recorded part 1 of what's going to be a 2-part interview with a couple of experts in neurobehavioral disorders. And by that, I mean attention deficit or ADD, ADHD, and autism and the entire autism spectrum. And I have part 2 of that interview series scheduled for later in September. And so in preparation for releasing that interview, my plan is to start a series that I'll probably call the Better Brain Equation. This is a phrase that I've used with my own clients for many, many, many years. And the basic idea is, how do you take a brain in any condition and make it healthier? And I sum that up in what I call the Better Brain Equation. So what I'll do more than likely is I'll have a few episodes where I lay the foundation of brain development and brain function and health, so that once I publish the interview, you guys are going to have a solid foundation to understand how truly remarkable the work of these 2 clinicians has been. And I really look forward to you hearing that. So stay tuned for that right here on the Inflammation Nation podcast. This podcast is for general informational and educational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine in any form or capacity. No doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of the information in this podcast or any materials associated with or linked to the podcast is at the listener's own risk. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional and personalized medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and listeners should not disregard or delay obtaining proper medical advice when a health condition exists and warrants that. And finally, functional medicine is not intended or designed to treat disease, but rather is a natural approach to support restoring health and wellness. The use of diet and lifestyle modifications and nutritional supplementation is supportive or adjunctive care.